Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. We are here for another history lesson. I know you're all super excited about it, right? We are about to tackle the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, it's not that you're excited about the 1960s and 70s, it's that we are 2 weeks away from being finished with this class. Yes, I am just as excited as you guys are. So keep in mind, we don't have a final, right? But instead of a final, we actually have a paper. So that is still due at the end of the semester like it always has been. You have a discussion board post this week as well as a content quiz. So without further ado, let's hop into the 1960s and the 1970s. Okay, so let's jump right into it. And first, we are going to start with the civil rights movement, right? Because when people think of the 1960s, it's often the movement that they think about first and foremost. And the 1960s was a really turbulent time in the United States. You had the Vietnam War, you had the Civil Rights Movement, you had the start of the women's movement, you have all of these things going on that are culturally and societally going to change the United States. Now, among the anti-war protests, there was actually another major movement that was taking place. Black Americans across this country were in the struggle for their civil rights. And they faced segregated public accommodations, things from separate water fountains to separate cinema seating to voter intimidation by whites. And after the first Reconstruction, which took place in the 1860s, 1870s, all the way to the 1880s, directly after the American Civil War, the problem with the first Reconstruction is that it simply failed to address the issue of civil rights. And it's going to take a second Reconstruction, if you will, or nearly 100 years later, for actual legislative change to come through and talk about the civil rights of African Americans in the United States. Now, nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South, not all of the slaves, but the ones that were not on the border of the Union and the Confederacy, but everyone in the Confederacy, right? It freed the blacks in the southern states, but those black people inhabited a starkly unequal world, especially in the southern states. Now, this was across the United States, but in the South in particular, there was these things called Jim Crow laws, and it was state-sanctioned discrimination is really what it was. And there were a lot of various forms of oppression during this time. There was race-inspired violence like lynching. There was the Ku Klux Klan. There was a lot of things that were race-inspired. And Jim Crow laws were just the start of it, right? And these were actual laws that were put at the local and the state level, right? And their entire purpose was to bar blacks from classrooms, from bathrooms, from theaters, from train cars, from juries, from running for office, for doing any of those things. And I know that nobody likes jury duty, and you're like, man, why would you sign up for that? But serving jury duties means that you can also, serve as a politician because you're a registered voter, and that's important because if you don't like the world you live in, then you can have you have the power to go change it because you can be a politician and be the politician you want to see. If you're like, man, there's this thing that's really important to me, but nobody seems to care, I promise you're not alone. There's just somebody who doesn't have a voice yet, right? You can be that voice. So if you don't like something, go change it. The problem is that the black people in the United States during the 1960s, the 50s, and back, they didn't have any way to have somebody fighting for them at the legislative level, right? In court systems, they couldn't be judges, they couldn't be lawyers, they couldn't be all of these things that you need to be in order to, get to government status. And it's not going to be until 1954 that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to strike down separate but equal. Now, the separate but equal doctrine was put through by Plessy versus Ferguson. It is that famous court case where it essentially formed the very basis, the foundation of state-sanctioned discrimination. When the Supreme Court decided separate but equal is not an okay doctrine, what separate but equal was, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about that in my next slide. I'm not going to talk about it here. See, look at me jumping around. I apologize. So yeah, and we will talk in just a moment about what separate but equal, what Plessy versus Ferguson and all of that stuff is. So in 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court decides this is not okay, it actually drew both national and international interest or attention to the issue at hand, right? To state-sanctioned discrimination, and it's going to take another decade and a half or so that civil rights activists are going to use nonviolent protests, sometimes violent protests, civil disobedience, to bring about change in the United States. Because just because a law is put into place, it doesn't mean that somebody is going to be there to enforce it. So it's incredibly important that when you have something that you're passionate about, that you don't just stop once the law goes through. Activists are so important to make sure that you continue in that forward motion, right? You want to keep moving forward. And the way to do that is to continue your activism. Like, okay, cool, we've got, separate but equal knocked down, but we still have a long road ahead. And they certainly do. The government is going to make actual legislative headway, though, during the 1960s. Things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'm tongue-tied today, I'm sorry. Now, what that did is it prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1968. That gave equal housing opportunities, regardless of race, religion, or national origin. And it made it a federal crime that to, quote, by force or by threat of force, injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone by reason of their race, color, religion, or national origin. What that essentially means is that you can't tell a family that just because your neighborhood is white, I'm sorry, you're black, you can't buy a house here, which was happening, okay? Like, that kind of blows my mind a little bit. I'm like, what do you mean you couldn't just be in this neighborhood because you were black? Like, that blows my mind now, but of course it does because I'm, not from that generation. But that's what the Civil Rights Act of 1968 did. So you do get some small victories in between, the U.S. Supreme Court striking down separate but equal doctrine, but at the same time, there's not like a ton of strides made. Like, it's insane that there has to be a law to stop people from straight up being racist and being like, you can't be in my neighborhood because you're black. Like, that blows my mind. Anyways, there's going to be a lot of leaders within the black community that are going to rise to prominence during the civil rights movement. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks or Malcolm X. But you have to remember that there were so many people whose names didn't get written in history books that made this possible. Okay, they risked and sometimes lost their lives in the name of freedom and equality. And you have to take a moment and really appreciate that it's not just the leaders who, make a movement. It is everyone in between too. Sorry, I got thirsty. So the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, why did things change in the 1960s as opposed to the 1860s, right after the Civil War, and we get, the freeing of the slaves and all of those things? Why did it take 100 years for there to be actual legislative change? It took 100 years, right, for facilities for both blacks and whites to be equal. And why? And a big reason why it took so long was because of the ruling reached in 1896 by the Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what it did is it racially segregated public facilities. It made that legal. So you could have, two different libraries, one for whites and one for blacks. But those libraries, in order for it to be legal, had to be equal. So you had to have the same amount of books in this library as this library. You had to have the same kind of bathroom in this bathroom and this bathroom. And separate but equal was never equal, okay? It was certainly separate, but it was never equal. And that is going to be one of the main things that comes to light. And the biggest place that really shone was in education. Education was the biggest place that people said, look, you can clearly tell that schools for black kids are simply, worse. They're not as funded. They don't have as many books. They don't have access to proper teaching materials as these white schools that are right up the road. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Sorry. So yeah, we get, the ruling that constitutionally speaking, African Americans, they could not share the same buses or schools or public facilities as whites. And these laws are known as Jim Crow laws. And they were established to support separate but equal doctrine. And that doctrine is going to stand for the next 6 decades, right? 60 years. And that's a long time to be like, okay, yes, here's separate but equal. 60 years is an entire generation of people, right, who were born and then had to live in this world. Not to mention that, they're having children and grandchildren. So that's 3 generations that are going to be directly affected by separate but equal. And that's a minimum of 3 generations. I'm being gracious there. Now, things do slowly start to change during the 1940s with World War II. And that's because, the federal government suddenly became quite supportive of civil rights because, they recognized that, African Americans played a crucial role in the military and they desperately needed men in World War II, and they kind of started to not really care what color you were. They did care because there was still separate barracks and separate hospitals and separate units with separate stuff. And so, I mean, separate but equal was practiced even during World War II. But, we do start to see some change in the 40s. We see, Black people really start to band together and be like, we need civil rights at home. If our blood is good enough to spill and die in the name of freedom and equality, then by gosh, we should have freedom and equality where we are. Now, the modern period of the civil rights reform can be divided into several different phases. And each of those phases, which I'm not going to break them down for you because that sounds boring and such, and I want you guys to really grasp how important all of this stuff is. What you need to know is that every phase of the civil rights movement, it began with isolated small-scale protests. And those protests ultimately resulted in the emergence of new and sometimes, more often than not, militant movements, leaders, and organizations. And that's because when you try something peacefully and nobody wants to listen to you because I guess, when you're yelling, the person with the megaphone is like, no, don't listen to this person over here, right? And you can't be heard, so I'm just going to punch the guy with the megaphone in the face and I'm going to take his megaphone so I can be heard. People are like, oh, but violence. Don't even get me started on the whole Kaepernick thing, okay? Because people are like, you can't protest like that. And then he kneels down peacefully protesting and people are like, no, but that's not what I meant either. And it's like, what do you mean? I don't want to talk about it. We'll be here a whole long time, okay? Which I know you guys don't want. What are we sitting at? I'm already at 13 minutes. I'm so sorry. All right, so let's hop into what happens in the 1950s, because the 1950s is the first time that we really get actual legislative change for civil rights for African Americans. Now, the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was working very hard to challenge segregation laws. And the first place that they could really challenge that was in public schools. And that's because it was so clear that, schools for Black children were simply not equal to those of white children. And so there was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the plaintiffs in several different states. It wasn't just one state, it was a couple. South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware are just some of the states that were involved in this. But the most famous case among these is going to be Brown versus the Board of Education. And this actually takes place in Kansas. Now, the plaintiff of this is Oliver Brown. He filed a class action lawsuit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1951. And he did this because he saw the school that his daughter was to attend. Her name was Linda Brown, and he didn't like it. And when he applied to the local white school, his daughter was denied entrance into one of the all-white elementary schools. And at that point, he filed a lawsuit because he was like, it's very clear that, this school's not equal to this school. And I want my daughter to go to this school so she can have a better future. And in this lawsuit, Brown is going to claim that the schools for Black children were not equal to the schools for white children. And that segregation, that kind of segregation, it violated the Equal Protection Clause, which was the 14th Amendment. There is a little protection clause in there that says that no state can, quote, deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, why do I bring that up? That's because in Plessy versus Ferguson, it said that segregation was legal so long as it was equal. And in education, you could clearly see that no matter what, it wasn't equal. So we had segregation, separate, but not equal, which is a direct violation of the 14th Amendment, which says that, you have to protect your people under the laws. So if you're going to have segregation, if it's going to be separate, it must be equal. And this was clear that it was simply not equal. The schools were different. And the case went before the U.S. District Court in Kansas, which agreed to the public school. They agreed. So it goes all the way to what would be like, I don't know, a district court in Kansas. So I don't know how Kansas is set up. And being in Texas, we actually have like our own Supreme Court here, and it's really weird, and I don't know. But anyways, not to get into the court system, pretty much what this court concludes, this is the important part, is they said that when it came to public school segregation, that it, quote, had a detrimental effect upon colored children and contributed to a sense of inferiority, end quote. So they're literally admitting that, black children don't have the same opportunities as white children. Not only that, but it causes, mental problems. It messes with their self-esteem, if you will, to have separate but equal. However, this court goes on to say that they are going to uphold separate but equal because what are we going to do? Literally, like, they just didn't have a solution. So they were like, well, let's just stick with the old stuff because then we don't have to come up with solutions. That's not a good solution. Now, Brown's case and 4 other cases related to the same topic, to school segregation, they came before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1952. The court combined all of these cases into one single case, and it became Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Now, at first, the justices, so in the Supreme Court, there are 9 justices. Those are the old, typically they're old white dudes. Definitely in the 1960s, they were a bunch of old white dudes. Now we have a little bit of diversity on there, slowly but surely, right? But it's 9 guys who essentially make decisions for the Supreme Court, right? Because we got those 3 branches of government: the executive branch, which is the president; we have Congress, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate; and then we have the judiciary branch of government, which is the Supreme Court. Oh my goodness, I can say words. Anyways, so the justices, the Supreme Court justices, were actually divided on how to rule when it came to school segregation. The Chief Justice, so the main head honcho that's involved, he really wanted the Plessy versus Ferguson verdict to stand. Now, lucky for us, and I say us as in liberals, Vinson, who was the Chief Justice at the time, he dies. And when a Supreme Court justice dies, because that's the only way, you either have to step down or you have to die in order to not be on the Supreme Court anymore. When he dies, President Eisenhower, who was fairly liberal, he replaced him with a man named Earl Warren. And Earl Warren was the governor of California at the time. And he said, hey, Earl, buddy, old pal, I want you to come be a part of the Supreme Court. And he displayed some very considerable political skill and determination, because when it came to this subject in particular, he was like, listen, school segregation's got no place in this country. And he succeeded in getting a unanimous verdict against school segregation the very following year. In that decision, which was issued on May 17th, 1954, Warren wrote this, quote, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal, end quote. As a result, the court ruled that the plaintiffs were being deprived, quote, deprived of their equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, end quote. That's great, right? Yes, we've got actual legislative change, says separate but equal. In this instance, it is not equal. Therefore, it does not hold up. But where do we go from here? In its verdict, The Supreme Court didn't specify exactly how schools were to be integrated. How do we get rid of segregation? And instead of trying to figure it out for each state, because remember, the Supreme Court is way up here, right? And then you have the state courts, and then you have like counties and then districts, counties, cities, et cetera, right? Local, whatever. Now, the reason why our court system is set up that way is because the Supreme Court goes, hey, listen, this big thing up here, it's not good for everybody. So we're going to desegregate schools. But what might work for New York, it might not work for Massachusetts, or what will work for Texas and California is not going to work for New York or for, Connecticut or Rhode Island, because Texas is this big, California is this big, and then you have like Rhode Island, which is teeny tiny, right? And that's not going to work. And so it's left up to the states to try and determine how exactly to go by desegregation. Oh my gosh. How to integrate schools. In May of 1955, the court issued its opinion and said, listen, you have to desegregate schools with deliberate speed. That's all they said, right? Because keep in mind, right, they're there to large overview, and then they're going to go down from there because they don't necessarily know what's best for each state. So they're going to let that up to the states. Now, I really don't think that the court's intentions were bad here. I think that they were really trying to do the best with what they had, but their best simply wasn't good enough, and the states are going to take that as, we will do it as slow as we please. And yeah, it brings us to our next slide, which is talking a little bit about, the evasion of desegregation. Okay, so the court, right? The court systems have decided that there's no room for segregation in schools, in the public school system. And in order to get rid of that, we now have to talk about integration. And there's going to be a lot of states who are going to evade desegregation simply because they don't want to put in the work and because they're racist. Like, it boils down to racism. It just simply does. Now, there are going to be a couple of states like Kansas and other states that are going to absolutely act in accordance with this verdict. They're going to, at both, local and state levels, desegregate schools quite quickly as they can. But there are going to be states, especially in the South, that are simply going to defy it. One of the best examples we have of this, defying of federal government at the state level was by Governor Orville Faddis of Arkansas. He actually called out the National Guard to prevent black students from attending high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Now I want this to really sink in for you guys, because the photo on the back of this PowerPoint right now is a photo of one of the black girls who was 16, and she's trying to go to school, right? Trying to go to high school. Half of you guys would skip if you could, right? I'm sure more than half of you guys are like, staying at home and doing online school is like the best. I love it. This girl wanted to go to high school, and the governor of the state calls out the National Guard. Okay, full helmets, battle gear, rifles, the whole enchilada, right? To prevent these 9 students from going to high school. And one of the things that always surprises me is when you start looking, there is a video at the end of this slide that I want you all to watch. It's very short, and it's actually a firsthand account from several of the Little Rock 9 talking about their experience that day and how they felt and everything. And I'm always so shocked by the pure hatred on half of these people's faces, just having this girl who wants to go to school to learn being in their presence. And yeah, while the Brown versus Board of Education decision, it actually demonstrated that there was legislative change that could happen, that the NAACP worked, and that, as long as black activists continued down that path of activism, that, there could be actual legislative change. What was quickly realized by the Little Rock 9 and all of this stuff that goes down is that it only worked when black people who were acting individually or in small groups, they assumed a lot of the risk that was associated with crossing those racial barriers. So let's desegregate. And when they got the okay, these 9 kids are trying to go to high school. And after this first day, they could have been like, yeah, no way. I'm just going to go back to my other high school, right? Like, I don't want to get shot by the National Guard. Instead, they continue to show up every single day, hoping that they'll be able to get into school. And that assumes they're assuming so much personal risk. These kids are 16 and 17 years old. They want to go to school, and in order to do that, they have to cross this racial barrier that has been in place since the birthing of the United States. And I want you guys to understand that that's the only way this works. It only works because these people had the courage to cross those boundaries, and yeah, they didn't accept that this is how life is. They said, I don't accept it, and I'm going to make sure that this change goes through. And even after the Supreme Court declared that, public school segregation was unconstitutional, if it wasn't for Black activism there to implement this decision, to compel the federal government to actually implement this decision, it could have just fallen short. That could have been where it ended, right? And we might still live in a semi-segregated society. But because they continued to push and they said, if it can happen in public schools, it can happen elsewhere, we slowly get the dismantling of, 100 years of Jim Crow, but, really like 400 years of slavery and everything that was attached to it. Let's talk a little bit about the initial phase of Black protest activity in the post-Brown period. Because after we get Brown versus the Board of Education, there are a lot of things that are going to start changing and that need to change. The first initial phase started on December 1st of 1955, and that was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white bus rider, and therefore defied the Southern custom that required Blacks to give up their seat towards the front of the buses to whites, or if there was no more sitting room, then Black people had to get up and give their seat to, a white person. Now, fun side fact, okay, on March 2nd of 1955, so several months before Rosa Parks does it, there was a young woman named Claudette Colvin. And she was actually the first Black woman to refuse to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested and put into jail, but it's Montgomery's Black leaders who decided that instead of publicizing, Claudette Colvin's pioneering effort, if you will, they kind of set her down and they said, hey, listen, 1, she was a teenager. 2, she was pregnant by a married man. And the people described her as being feisty or mouthy or emotional. Sorry, I just totally hit my mic. And those were descriptor words, right, that people said about her. And the Black leadership sat down and said, hey, listen, we really appreciate that you're doing this. We think this is a great idea, but unfortunately, we can't use you for the movement because, well, white people are just not going to gravitate towards you. You're young, you're feisty. She was also darker skinned than Rosa Parks was. There's a lot of discrimination still in the Black community, varying on, how Black you are, like how dark your skin is. And so they were like, do you mind if we use this idea, but with this little old lady? And they, showed her Rosa Parks. And yeah, the thing is Rosa Parks was lighter skinned. She was well mannered. She was studious. She was calm. She was also one of the few Black women to actually have the right to vote in Alabama after taking and failing the dumb test that shouldn't have even been allowed, that shouldn't have been constitutional. She took it like 3 times and failed. Anyways, this is somebody that white people can get on board with, but you're not that somebody, Claudette. And so they decided instead to go with Rosa Parks. And Claudette Colvin, which snaps to her, okay, she said, yeah, absolutely. It's not about me. It's about all of us. And for a feisty, mouthy, emotional teenager who was pregnant, I mean, like, that's some big stuff. She was like, it's not about me. It's about the Black community. And if this is what needs to be done, if it needs to be Rosa Parks, then I'm good with that. Let's do that. And so once Rosa Parks, sat in the back of the bus and then wouldn't give up her seat, she was jailed. And the Black community started boycotting the city's busing systems. The boycott lasted for more than a year. And the biggest part about this, you guys, is that they, um, how do I explain? They depended on the buses in the same way that we depend on cars nowadays. You know, often because black people weren't allowed in neighborhoods, inner city neighborhoods, they would either, well, I mean, I say like, like neighborhoods how we have today, they weren't allowed to be in close proximity to a lot of like the rich white folks that, they were either butlers or nannies or cooks or whatever it is. They didn't have access to cars. And so they would either have to, all pile into a truck to get to, their work, or they would have to walk. And sometimes it was miles, it would be like 5 miles one way. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't want to walk 5 miles to school. I mean, let alone to work. And they did, because the boycott, what it really demonstrated was unity and determination of black residents. And it inspired so many black people elsewhere across the nation to start doing their own movements, their own boycotts of things. And of course, we know that Martin Luther King Jr. kind of emerges, that's a better word, as the boycott movement's leader in Montgomery, Alabama. And through, even though Parks and King were members of the NAACP, they also established a different, regional organization for Montgomery, Alabama, for Alabama and other southern states. And this was, clergy led. It was a Christian leadership group, and President King, Martin Luther King Jr. was the president of this organization, and it was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to remain a major spokesperson for black aspirations, not just in Montgomery, but across the nation. And yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't talk about Malcolm X, but Malcolm X, yeah, he does a lot of the same stuff Martin Luther King does. He's all about one of the things that really sets them apart is the same thing that set apart W.E.B. Du Bois and, oh no, I don't remember the other guy's name right this moment. This is what I get for trying to reference other things. But, Malcolm X was very much like, we don't need white people, black power. We need to empower ourselves and take care of our community, and we don't need white help from whites, essentially. Martin Luther King Jr. believed that the best way to get what his community needed done was to be nonviolent, to work with whites, and get them on board with, the black cause. So it's just two different schools of thought. They both worked. At the end of the day, they were both successful men. They were both big civil rights leaders, and both of their strategies worked. They were both assassinated. So, if one was better than the other, then they probably wouldn't have both been assassinated. But, they were both very good at what they did, and so they were both assassinated. Now then, you can watch, if you are interested in wrapping up the civil rights movement and all of that stuff, there is a video here on the PowerPoint. It is Crash Course U.S. History. It is the Civil Rights Part 2 video that he did. And yeah, so that's that. I will see you guys in just a moment. We will pick up with the 1970s. The 1970s is here. Now on this PowerPoint slide, you will see that I have two things bolded. That's because those are the two things that I'm going to spend the most time on. We're already sitting at 33 minutes, and I like to, stay under an hour for you all. So let's talk about the 1970s. The 1970s was a very boisterous time. In a lot of ways, the 1970s as an entire decade was just a continuation of the 1960s. For women and African Americans, Native Americans, gays and lesbians, and many other marginalized people continued their fight for equality, there's also going to be a lot of Americans that suddenly find themselves protesting against the ongoing war in Vietnam. Now, there is a lot going on in the 70s, some of which I'm just going to gloss over, and other events we're going to spend more time on. So we're going to spend the most time on the women's rights movement and the Watergate scandal, but we will touch on the other things. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the oil crisis, because there is one in 1973. There are going to be Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, as most people know it by. And there was a war going on, the Yom Kippur War. And it was announced that OPEC was no longer going to ship petroleum to nations that supported Israel, especially in its conflict with Syria and Egypt. So basically, what they were saying is they're not going to give petroleum to the United States and its allies in Western Europe. And because of this, the price of oil increases dramatically. Like today, the West is very dependent on oil. So due to oil prices literally quadrupling, there were also measures put into place in Western European countries and the United States for rationing oil. The Western world is plunged into an economic recession. The United States, while impacted by this oil crisis and the recession, we did have our own oil reserves, and we were affected by the recession, certainly, but the biggest impact is actually going to be on the Western European economies. We also get, in the 1970s, the end of the Vietnam War. After a little more than 10 years in the war in Vietnam, it finally comes to a close in 1973, when Allied forces officially and completely pull out of South Vietnam. We are now going to move right along into the women's movement. The women's rights movement! You know, I'm very excited to tell you guys a little bit about second wave feminism. I'm sorry again, it's very white. Women of color, I promise you, third wave feminism, we got you, but second wave feminism is pretty white. Now, there was a significant growth in women's rights as a movement and our role in society during the 1970s. Now, it does sort of start in the 1960s, as do most things. So like I said, you know, the civil rights movement wasn't just birthed out of the 1960s, right? It started in the 1940s, and then we get legislation in the 50s, and then we get more legislation in the 60s. Same thing is going to happen with the women's rights movement. Now, there was the invention and the large distribution of the contraceptive pill or birth control, and there was also the legalization of abortion. Why is this important? Well, first and foremost, now that women could decide whether or not they wanted to have abortions and they had access to birth control, women could now decide when, where, and if they wished to have children. And this did extend to married women, which was a really big deal because once you were married, it was like they tried to hold birth control from you. And there were a lot of women, you know, who were in forced marriages and unhappy marriages. And, you know, then they would get stuck with their 17 children because, you know, it was a different time and everybody just banged all the time. So birth control plays an incredibly important role in the advancement of women, not just women in general, but like women in the workplace specifically. The reason why is because it allowed us to invest in our careers and to even plan for our futures and, you know, plan for our futures in a way that it didn't necessarily involve marriage and it didn't have to involve children. And just to drive this home, okay, there was research conducted by the CDC. We all know what that is because we're living in Corona times. But the CDC, the Control for Disease Center, yeah, I think that's it. Anyways, in 1983 to 2010, they did a study. And what this study showed is that the pill was responsible for nearly 1/3 of women's wage increases in relativity to men. So we did see an increase in women's wages after the pill had been accessible for several years. I'll actually post the link to the study on Blackboard for anyone who's interested, and I will probably post it also in the description below, simply because if somebody stumbles across this that's not in my class and they're like, she be lying, I'm like, nah, here's the study right here, it's official. And just to segue it into something that is modern, that is one of the biggest reasons, right? Birth control, accessibility to birth control and abortions. You can't have true equality with men as a woman until you have access to those things. And that's why the Affordable Health Care Act, which gives women affordable access to birth control at no additional copay, is absolutely so important, okay? We need the Affordable Health Care Act to be, you know, accepted in all states because it gives women the equality that we need in order to actually be on equal footing as men. And Yeah, but of course my opinions on healthcare is probably a 20-minute video in and of itself, so I will just leave it at that for right now. Let's talk a little bit about the Equal Rights Amendment, because this is a really big one. It was, or is a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution. It was designed to guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of their sex. It was first proposed by the National Women's Party in 1923. That party should ring a bell. We talked a little bit about it when we talked about World War I, but it wasn't officially introduced into to Congress until the revival of feminism in the late 1960s. Hold on, I'm choking, sorry. Water. Okay, so yeah, what was I talking about? The Equal Rights Amendment. Yeah, that's the words. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment, when it was initially proposed to Congress in the 60s, it is going to take a while, but eventually it is going to win 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives in 1971, October of 1971. It is then later going to be approved by the United States Senate in March of 1972. Then, once it's been approved by both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, you would think, yeah, well, obviously it becomes a law. But then it was sent to the states in March of 1972, and it was then up to the states to ratify this amendment. Hawaii is going to be the first state to ratify it, and it would have been the 27th Amendment had it gone all the way completely through, which, spoiler alert, it doesn't. That's why I was like, is, would have, using past tense verbs. Yeah, there were several states who quickly followed Hawaii's example. There was something like 30 states within a year said, yeah, absolutely, we want to pass this, we want to ratify it. But, and it's a big but, you guys, the important part of this sentence, right, is that it would have been the 27th Amendment. And that's because during the mid-1970s, all of a sudden we get a very big conservative backlash against feminism. Anti-feminists, if you will, because lack of a better word, they eroded support for the Equal Rights Amendment. And ultimately, it fails to achieve ratification by like 38 states or something. It needed 3/4 of the states in order to be ratified into the Constitution, and it just misses the mark. Sad day. I can't imagine why some women wouldn't want the Equal Rights Amendment, but you know, they exist. Like, that's why we don't have it, because it exists. Anyways, since it was rejected, sexual equality, with the exception of the right to vote, because, you know, that was a different law all in of itself, it just simply isn't protected by the U.S. Constitution, which is kind of mind-boggling to me. Since the 1970s, both the federal government and all states have passed some sort of considerable legislation that does protect the legal rights of women, but it was not the Equal Rights Amendment. But one example that I can give you that most of you will probably know is Title IX. We talked a little bit about Title IX way back at the beginning of the semester when we went over my syllabus. Most of you should know what it is. It's part of the education amendments, and it protects people from discrimination based on sex and education programs or activities that receive any federal like financial assistance. It's also Title IX as, you know, if you are sexually harassed in any way on campus, then, you know, you can come talk to somebody and we will get you with the Title IX coordinator. It's all a part of those educational amendments. So that is one thing that, you know, all states have passed since the Equal Rights Amendment. So there has been strides. However, sexual equality, much like racial equality, it still eludes our country. Like, it's just something that we still struggle with as an entire society. We struggle with racial equality. We struggle with sexual equality. You know, there's a lot of things that, you know, this country could be doing better that it simply isn't. Now, I am going to post this This video, there it is. I can do it. Ah, it's in backwards, you know. It's in reverse. Anyways, this 10-minute video right here is over Roe versus Wade, which was a court case that essentially made abortion legal for the entire country. I'm not going to go over it simply because we're already at 45 minutes and I still have like 2 more slides, and I don't want to bore you guys to death. I'm trying to get us out of here quickly. So watch this video. It's some guy who I think is like a social sciences teacher, so he doesn't really get political. He just kind of tells you here's everything that happened. And I mean, I found him entertaining to watch. So take the 10 minutes, educate yourself on Roe versus Wade. I'll see you next slide. The Watergate scandal. It is time to talk about Watergate. Just a little bit, just a scotch. The Watergate scandal was a political scandal that involved the administration of President Richard M. Nixon. There was the arrest of 5 burglars in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office / apartment / hotel complex. It's a lot of different things in Washington, D.C. Now, this happens on June 17th of 1972, and it was promptly covered up by Nixon's administration. Now, why is any of this important? Well, I gave you a documentary that you can watch. Nope. Oh, God, I did it again. Right down there somewhere. It's on that slide over here. It's on the slide over here, right? And the reason why it's important is because it was basically bugging is illegal. I mean, it's not so much illegal anymore. Thank you, Patriot Act. But, you know, it was illegal to just wiretap whatever you wanted, and come to find out, people in Nixon's administration were wiretapping the Democratic Committee's stuff to try and get insider information about candidates, and Nixon was paranoid, and there's a lot of really good stuff. And you know what, this documentary is actually really fun. It's done in a very like investigate TV murder mystery type of feel to it. It is 45 minutes long. I know that's a bit long, but it's worth it. I had a great time watching it. It's put out by National Geographic. And yeah, anyways, the conclusion to all of that is that on August 9th of 1974, Richard Nixon, who was facing probable impeachment for his role in covering up the scandal, he resigned from the United States' his presidential position, and he becomes the only president in the history of the U.S. to resign. So instead of being impeached, he was like, GG, I'm out, I quit, which is crazy. Most presidents don't quit. Some presidents we wish would. Anyways, I'm not done yet. I forgot that I have one more thing to talk about, and that is the Iran hostage crisis of 1979. Now, on November 4th of 1979, there are going to be a group of Iranian students who storm the U.S. Embassy. They take more than 60 American hostages, and the students do eventually set these hostages free after really long, hard negotiations. They are set free January 21st of 1981. That was 444 days after the crisis began, and just hours after President Ronald Reagan delivered his inaugural speech, which inside of it, he basically said, you let our people go or I'm going to blow you to smithereens. And I guess they thought he wasn't dicking around. So they said, yep, you got it, and released our people. If you want to watch an exciting movie that's okayly historically accurate, then I would say go watch Argo with Ben Affleck, and it is all about the Iranian hostage crisis. Just saying. That's right, we've made it to the end. Another lecture down, another week gone. Now, obviously, there are going to be a lot of people who, weren't happy with the social changes that were brought forth in the United States during the 1960s and the 1970s. And that's to be expected. Anytime marginalized populaces start gaining rights, the people who were previously in power often feel like that power that they have is threatened. Think of it like this. Rich white men, right? They have always had a megaphone. And the whole time, right, in the United States, every rich white guy had a megaphone. And then, poor white guys got a megaphone, which lessened the rich white guy's voice, which it really didn't, right? It just gave the poor white guy a megaphone. Now, what happens in the 1960s, the 1970s, and then the 1980s is that instead of taking the megaphone away from rich and poor white men, we suddenly are giving megaphones to everyone else. So that way their voice can also be heard. And that makes the people who had the megaphones to begin with feel like their voice is less heard. But really what it is that now they're not the only voice who is being heard. And that makes people feel threatened. And this happens throughout all of history, okay? It happens today even when somebody gets something and, somebody who had previous power, like, oh, that person is just a diversity hire. Well, yeah, I guess, most straight white men have no idea what a diversity hire is. They're like, what? That's dumb. I should have gotten the job. And it's like, but why? Were you the most qualified? Can you prove it? Anyways, that's beside the point. My point is that marginalized populaces in the 1960s and 1970s, they finally have their own megaphone, right? Their voice is finally being heard. We're not taking away the voices from anybody else. We're just giving megaphones to everybody else. And the results of the movements in the 1960s and the 1970s had a lot of things that suddenly, it was a lot of change over 2 decades. And here's the results of what happened. When Roe versus Wade guaranteed the right to an abortion, we suddenly get a fervent pro-life movement that was dedicated to, protecting the unborn child. And that's obviously because, abortion is just bad. So there is, the liberal side of things where, yes, a woman should have complete control of her body. And then there's the other side, which, is the other side of the coin. And they're like, no, it's not her decision. What about the child type of thing? So you get, both sides of each coin. Anti-feminist, they start yelling, rallying behind, striking against the Equal Rights Amendment. They claimed that it was eroding the traditional family unit, and so they are going to really be fervently against the Equal Rights Amendment. We also get a lot of ordinary American people who are suddenly shocked at the promiscuous content that can be found, not only in films, but on magazines. And there are more magazines, kind of like Playboy, that are, risque. And people are like, what is happening to our society? It is, we are damned, right? We're all going to hell. It's Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. The people who believed that homosexuality was a sin started to criticize the newly vocal gay rights movement that has started to emerge in 1969 and then progresses through the 1970s and really gains a lot of momentum by the 1980s. The divorce rate and the crime rate both rose during the 1960s and the 1970s, and there were an increasing number of Americans who started to blame, liberalism and the welfare establishment and, all of these things on their social problems, like you are the problem, like if we just got back to traditional family values, then, the United States would be fine. Essentially what happens is that there's like a cultural war that is being unfolded during the 1970s. And it's a war that is going to directly shape the United States that we inhabit today. And we will pick up there talking about how the, wave, the next era is quite conservative with the rise of Ronald Reagan and the new right. That's all I have for you. So have a great weekend, you guys. If you have any questions, comment in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Blackboard. You all know my email address. And you have my phone number if you have anything that you're like, I was really confused. As always, remember that sex and drugs kill. Wash your hands, right? And social distancing is sexy. I will see you all next week. Bye.